Hello, everyone. I'm George Roscoe.
And I'm Mark Schneider.
And we want to welcome you to today's episode 42 of Say What, where we talk about the threats to our children in the public school system, including a way out of public schools through vouchers or educational saving accounts.
That's right, George. You know, you'd think this would be a slam dunk for parents looking for a way out of the public school system. But it turns out there's a lot of inside baseball debate on this issue, and not for lack of good cause. There's actually concern in the private school and homeschool community that there would be too many strings attached with some of these voucher programs, depending on the way they're implemented. So that's something that we wanted to address today.
Yep, and I know for sure, just looking back at the last couple of years, we've had a lot of good Supreme Court cases, and one actually in the docket right now. So we're going to be touching upon those and how they might affect us here in California specifically, because we're going to walk through the California version. And there are things like this implemented in other states, and because they have their own state laws, maybe some of these concerns are not as critical. But we're going to walk through here for our listeners. Please note we're going to focus here on the state of California for this topic.
That's right. And using California as our example, I think it's good just to provide our listeners with some background. So as you and I both know, there are about 6.5 million kids in the K through 12 public school system here in California, both primary and secondary education. About a 500,000 of those are in private schools. And we don't know the exact number. It's hard to come by because when you're a homeschooler, you have to fill out what's called a private school affidavit, PSA, and you do that every October. And while we do know the number of PSAs that are filled out, we don't know the number of students in each household that is filling out a PSA. So getting a good, accurate number of how many kids are actually being homeschooled is hard to come by. But we know it's somewhere between 100 and 200,000 in the state of California. So the rub of all this is that still, even with an incredible increase in the number of homeschoolers, particularly since COVID hit us, and there has been a dramatic increase. In fact, homeschooling has gone up some 61% according to several reports. Even with that, George, still, as you and I both know, the vast majority of our kids being taught are in the public school system.
Yep.
Well, 90%, probably over 90%. So here's the really cool thing now that is going on. There is an initiative statute that is being pushed by an organization called the California for School Choice. And it has been approved by the Secretary of State to gain signatures. And if we gain enough signatures, and we need 1 million, they're trying to get 1.5 million just to be on the safe side, but we need 1 million signatures. Then this will be on the 2022 ballot, which is not that far away. It's going to happen this next year. November. The initiative is called the Educational Freedom Act, and here's what it would do. It would essentially set up what's called an educational savings account, an ESA, that will be established for each K through 12 child in California who actually opts in to this program. So that's number one. This ESA would be set up for each child. Each year, that account would be credited with the student's share of what are known as Prop 98 funds. So this is a statute in California that requires a certain percentage of the general fund to go toward education. So it would be those funds that would go into this account. And it would roughly begin at $14,000 a year that would go into this ESA. The parent would be able to direct the ESA trust fund to a participating accredited private school. here's the rub. It's not necessarily going for homeschools. The schools that it would be allowed for, if it's private, would have to be an accredited school, either a non-secular, a non-sectarian school, or a parochial school, sectarian school, as long as it was accredited. And the accreditation would come ostensibly through the Western Association of Schools and Colleges. It's been around for a long time. Any unspent funds will accumulate and can be spent on college vocational training or other qualified educational expenses. So this is a really cool thing. So if you opt into this program and you can find, for example, a good elementary school education that doesn't cost $14,000 a year, and there are lots of them out there. I think the average elementary school tuition now is about between $9,000 and $10,000 a year. Well, that balance, that extra $4,000 a year goes in and starts accruing in this educational savings account.
Times 7 years. But then you have on top of that another, 7th through 12th grade.
That's right. So it's a lot of money that can accrue. Here's the big rub though. Will homeschoolers be eligible? The answer is yes and no. The Educational Freedom Act makes no special provision for homeschooling families. Parents can only use scholarship funds to educate their K through 12 children at public schools, charter schools, or accredited private and parochial schools, as we have mentioned. But, George, if a family decides that they are not going to opt into this program and use those monies to go to an accredited school, they can still homeschool their children. And that $14,000 a year accrues to their benefit.
Ooh.
Yes.
Say what?
So at the end of 12 or 13 years, you could have 14 times 12 is what, $168,000? 13 years, that's $182,000. All of that money could go for a college education.
All of it? There's no limit? There's no cap?
No cap.
Wow.
The whole thing could be saved up and go toward a college education, which is really, really great news. Here's the controversy, and this has happened in states that have similar kinds of programs, mainly voucher-type programs in different states around the country. Indiana, Wisconsin are the two notable examples. Florida also has a very robust voucher program. There are strings often attached to these laws. For example, in I think Wisconsin, they were required as part of their voucher program to mandate that if you send your child to an accredited private school, they would have to teach Common Core. So Common Core there's a lot of controversy surrounding that.
Very debatable.
Some people are okay with it. Most people who are conservatives, particularly in the Christian community, are not okay with this. And so there are lots of strings like that are attached to these programs. And as we both know, the more power that you give these institutions, particularly when they're in control of where this money goes. So you have to remember that this is a voucher program, and if you're going to a public school, it's not you that's paying this voucher money to the public school. You're going to the school, but the money is actually coming from the government. And if it's coming from the government, they want to have strings attached to it. They want to be in control of what's taught, how it's taught, when it's taught. And this is of right concern to people that don't want these strings attached. In fact, George, the Cato Institute did a pretty deep dive study on these particular programs, what kinds of strings are attached when these programs are instituted in states where they exist. And what they found was that the strings are substantial. So whenever these programs have existed, the government does tend to step in and start getting involved in what's taught and how it's taught. But interestingly enough, they happen more with voucher programs and not so much with tax credit programs. Now, there are a number of states that they have ESA kinds of situations, but they come in the form of a tax credit.
Okay.
So here's the difference. Rather than the government paying the school directly and therefore having strings attached, you just get this money in the form of a tax credit. And so now you as an individual have complete discretion on where to and how to spend this money. But unfortunately, most of the ESA kinds of programs are not set up as tax credits. And California is the same way. Under California's program, if this initiative statute were to become law, the government would actually be the payor, depending on what school the child is going in. So in an open letter to Wisconsin legislators, the Wisconsin Parents Association wrote this, and this is the concern. Programs that give public monies to homeschoolers would undermine our freedom to homeschool, as would legislation that attempts to guarantee our rights and freedoms. Government favors would require that homeschools be accountable to the government, which would make homeschools more like public schools. Our goal is to make your job as easy as possible and our homeschooling as successful as possible. No new homeschooling legislation is needed, and essentially any legislation would have drawbacks and risk. And then they go on to state, school vouchers are a Trojan horse for those schools who foolishly believe that they will get the money without any strings.
Yeah, and, some of the strings that I've heard about here in California, Mark, is that, well, if public schools require CSE to be taught, then now I'm going to send my kid to a private school through an ESA voucher, so they'll require that private school to start teaching CSE and ethnic studies and all of the other stuff and filth that happens in regular public schools. They
very well could. Currently in California, there is a state statute. The code is 69995-5. And here's what it says. The state, California, shall not impose any condition on the eligibility of a private school, college, or university to receive funds other than the following. Number one, periodic certification that an eligible child is enrolled and attending the school. That's reasonable, right? Number two, periodic certification that the amount paid is only used for tuition and eligible education expenses. That's reasonable. The school is currently accredited. Okay, you may not agree with that, but an argument could be made that that's reasonable as well. And finally, number four, the general health and safety standards applicable to all private schools are operating in these schools. That's reasonable as well. So currently, George, the law in California is pretty good. I mean, if this initiative statute went through and this law was left alone, these private schools would not be obligated to teach any of these particular curriculums. They could continue operating just as they are. The big question is, will it stay that way?
And just to maybe elaborate on that, will it stay that way? It's a rhetorical question, because we know that the CTA, the California Teachers Association, has hordes and hordes of lawyers.
They do.
Who know how to draft legislation, slip it to, whoever on the state assembly side or state senate side, push it through. They are the biggest, benefactor to our beloved tyrant Gavin Newsom. And so they will modify state law in their favor once again.
They will certainly try. And there has been an effort in recent years to cast scrutiny on the whole homeschooling movement. Some of our listeners may be familiar with the name Elizabeth Bartholet, who is a Harvard professor that wrote a famous law review article, I think in Arizona. It was with Arizona State or Arizona University, basically stating that homeschools need to be regulated, that they should not be able to operate very independently. And there was tremendous public outcry against Professor Bartholet and this whole viewpoint, and she went underground for a while. But certainly, if public funds now were being made available for people to, educate their kids as they see fit, I think you can expect that, there will be some legislative scrutiny in the future. So it is a realistic concern, George, that parents have about this. On the other hand, there are some points that we should think about.
Mm-hmm.
And the first one is what we talked about up front. 90+% of our children are in this public school monopoly.
Yeah.
And it is just that.
It's a monopoly.
They don't have any way to get out of this system. In California, as in most states, it requires two parents working full time just to be able to afford a family situation. One of the parents cannot stay home to homeschool the child. A very small minority of parents in California and in other states are in a situation where they can actually do that. And then what about single parent families? What option do they have, unless they're, financially pretty well endowed, to send their child to a private school? So you have these 6 million children now in our public school that basically don't have any option. They are captive to this public monopoly. Mm-hmm. And whenever there's a monopoly, there's no competition, and we know what happens when that's the case. We can't leave these children alone, George. We can't let them stay in this situation without any recourse. And so this is a fairly powerful argument on behalf of some type of educational savings account, even if there are some strings attached. Moreover, the battle over homeschool freedom, that's going to happen one way or the other.
Yes.
It's just a matter of time before that battle is levied. And here's the good news. As we know, George, our court has changed its complexion over the last several years, both at the Supreme Court level and at the appellate court level. There are many more conservative justices now in positions of power to weigh in on these cases than we have had in the past. All to say, if we are going to have this fight on homeschool independence, the time to have it is now.
Yes.
And there are a couple of cases that we've talked about before that give us some encouragement that maybe things will go our way. The first one is the famous case out of Montana, Espinoza versus Department of Revenue, that got argued last year, where the court said the state of Montana cannot exclude religious schools from receiving tax credit funded scholarships just because they're religious schools. Mm-hmm. That was a great decision in our favor. And then on the East Coast, there's another case that oral argument just happened a couple of weeks ago in the Supreme Court. The decision is going to probably come down in June or July, and that is Carson v. Macon. Here's the question that was asked of the court. Does a state law prohibiting students from participating in an otherwise generally available student aid program from choosing to use their aid to attend schools that provide religious or sectarian instruction violate the free exercise or equal protection clause of the U.S. Constitution? So in Maine, the situation was that they have these schools called school administrative units, and they don't have them covering the entire state. So if you're living in a rural community and your child has to travel 20 miles to get to one of these schools, that's not a very good situation. So they had this policy where they were making these funds, these scholarship funds, available to these kids to go to a private school in their area.
Yeah.
Well, it was working fine until the state stepped in and said, no, you can't do that because this is a religious school. We cannot have that.
Yep.
This case was just heard before the Supreme Court. And I listened to the oral argument in that case, George. And to my way of thinking, we have a very good chance of having the Supreme Court rule that no, taxpayer funds can be used by parents who freely choose It's their own personal decision to send their child to a sectarian school. And that would probably apply to homeschooling families as well.
And to me, Mark, these two cases also really help to set the groundwork for the concerns that parents have about strings attached. Well, in both of these cases, the court, if it rules in our favor in the second one as well, is basically saying, no, you cannot attach those strings, because then you're compelling speech or you're doing other things.
That's right.
That are prohibiting a person's, free exercise of religion.
Yeah.
So again, like you mentioned, Mark, I think the battle needs to be fought now, and parents need to stop worrying about this, and we just need to go on the offensive. And that's been my frustration in listening to these concerns is we're I don't know, we're so fearful and we operate in defensive mode all the time. We need to learn how to go on the offense.
And George, I'm speaking as a homeschool parent. My wife and I homeschooled both our kids, K through 12. So I understand this concern very well. But on the other hand, it's my personal conviction, and it's the conviction to protect our kids, that we cannot abandon, for the sake of a small minority of homeschoolers, the rest of the kids who are
stuck.
They're stuck
in
this public school monopoly. We have to do something to give the parents freedom to send their kids to another institution. So for all of those reasons, we think this is a battle that needs to be fought.
And the other, talking points, parents, if you're trying to convince your neighbor or others to sign, just think about minorities. Think about people of color. Think about disadvantaged communities, whatever the left wants to call them, right? Well, why isn't the left coming up with this idea? Because it should be helping these communities the most.
It should be.
Right? If I'm in Santa Ana, and here I am, a poor Romanian who just immigrated from Romania, and now I maybe get to send my kids to Mater Dei. Or, this is the kind of money we're talking about.
Absolutely.
So, learn how to make these talking points in a way that, your left, neighbors can really resonate and say, oh, have an aha moment. Like, wow, yeah. This should be something that I could support.
Yeah, so if this is something that animates you, and we hope it does, we encourage you to go to California School Choice. You can go to their website and learn more about this initiative. They're looking for signature gatherers to help get it on the ballot. If this is something that you have time to do, you probably want to take a look at that. And you can learn more about the law on their website.
And one little last idea that I want to throw out to pastors. Imagine you have 50, 100, 150 kids in your local church, and let's say half of them you could start a private school with at $14,000 per child. And that public school is renting facilities from your church, and you have those classrooms you're using for Sunday school. Imagine what it would mean to those kids to have that protection of when they're going to be taught by really great teachers in a school that's on your church's campus. I mean, this is the type of things that I've been telling pastors, and most of them said, George, I never even thought of that. They're like, when is this going to happen? I said, well, it potentially could happen in the next year. Are you ready? And so pastors need to start thinking about this and getting their administrative boards to start, putting a little committee together to say, hey, what can we do about starting a private school in our own church?
If you want to change lives, this is the way to do it.
Yeah. So thank you very much, everyone. This is episode 42. If you want any more information about Protect Our Kids, please go to our website, protectourkidsnow.org. You can also find all of our podcasts there, where Mark and I continuously look at various issues that affect our children in the public school system. So until next time, we sign off.
See you then.